Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
Hello and welcome to Czechast, the podcast in English about all things Czech. I'm Vít Pohanka. This is a really special episode. As I record this, I am officially on vacation. And believe it or not, I'm actually cycling through the US state of Indiana on my way from Pittsburgh to Chicago. But even out here in America, I can't quite stop following what's happening back home in Czechia. And recently, something landed in my inbox that I thought was simply too interesting not to share. It's a public discussion between Czech President Petr Pavel and Finnish President Alexander Stubb. It was organized by Europeum, a think tank based in Prague. It is a conversation about Europe, security, democracy, and the challenges facing our continent. Yes, it's broader than Czechia alone, but with the Czech president at the center of it, I thought it definitely belongs on Czechast. And there's another nice connection. First moderator introducing the Finnish president is Jan Bumba, who some of you may remember from an earlier Czechast episode. And the other is none other than Rob Cameron, my friend, colleague and co-host of our Blood in Bohemia special series. So, from somewhere on the road in Indiana, here is this special Czechast episode. Presidents Petr Pavel and Alexander Stubb of Finland in conversation with Jan Bumba and Rob Cameron.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.
As you noted, Mr. President, we indeed live in a world where the global norms and institutions are eroding, where we need united and strong Europe more than ever before. Facing rising, more, as you put it, assertive powers, Europe as the global champion of order based on rules is in danger of losing its position. And that is why the next speaker argues in his newly published book that we need what he calls a values-based realism. Let me welcome the President of the Republic of Finland, Mr. Alexander Stubb.
Thank you very much, and I have to say, judging by the applause that Petr just got, this must be an inherently pro-European audience. Before I begin, I should perhaps give you a little bit of a personal warning. I started my studies in the United States in 1989, pretty much during the time that the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War ended. Finland at the time was in a peculiar position. We felt very Western in terms of values and institutions, but because of constraints living next to the Soviet Union, we had never been able to integrate as far into the Western institutions that we wanted to, whether it was the European Union or NATO. We always had sort of halfway solutions. So for me personally, becoming interested in and excited in Europe and things European coincided with the end of the Cold War, when there was very much a feeling that we started to see the light at the end of the tunnel. So I decided at the time that I wanted to become an academic studying European integration, that I later wanted to become a civil servant when Finland joined the European Union in 1995. And I did that for many years before I then later on entered politics, only to be in Europe, in the European Parliament. So what I'm trying to say is that I am an EU nerd. I am very much pro-Europe, and I believe in the big project that we have endeavored in for over 80 years. What I'll say today, I'll give you a short introduction, and then I will give you 3 points and finally conclude with some concrete ways forward. And I'll be speaking about Europe more broadly, not only the European Union. So by way of introduction, I think we quite often forget why the European Union or the idea of Europe exists. And it's actually quite simple. 4 things: peace, prosperity, security, and stability. Those were the original ideas in 1952 when the European Coal and Steel Community were founded. And the 6 founding states at the time felt that we have to make war impossible between 2 countries, France and Germany, that had been in 3 wars against each other in 50 years. 2 of them ended up being world wars. And the whole idea was to create institutions, rules and norms in a context where you pooled sovereignty on important things at the time, like coal and steel, and actually nuclear energy, and later on economy. We quite often forget that. It was a big idea. And the interesting thing is that integration in one area quite often leads to pressure to integrate in another one. So you sort of begin with economic cooperation. Then you notice that, hey, this works. Let's do a common market. Then you notice that this works. Let's do a customs union. And then you notice, well, let's go for an internal market. This is benefiting all of us. Let's have a common currency. And the story goes on. It's obviously never a perfect world. We have to admit that. I say a little bit tongue-in-cheek that the European Union always advances in 3 phases. Phase number 1 is crisis. Phase number 2 is chaos. And phase number 3 is suboptimal solution. But that doesn't take away from the fact that Europe and the European Union is probably the greatest project that we have endeavored in the past 80 years. And a final point of introduction. I know there is this debate about federal or not, more Europe or less Europe. I think we should define Europe as something which is more than an international organization, so more than the UN, but less than a state. It's always somewhere in between, and we have decided to pool sovereignty to try to find common solutions to common problems. My 3 questions today. First, what is Europe? Second, why is this Europe's moment? And third, what should Europe do? The first, what is Europe? I think it's an idea, but it's also an identity. An idea that European unity makes us stronger together. An identity that you as Czechs, me as a Finn, are European. With that, there's another double concept, one being values, which Petr mentioned, and the other one being geography. And we quite often forget the value part. And it's quite simple. The values of the European Union are, number 1, human dignity, number 2, freedom, number 3, democracy, number 4, human rights, number 5, the rule of law, and number 6, the protection of minorities. It's quite simple and straightforward. Those are the values that we believe in. And yes, I admit, as a liberal democrat with a small l and a small d, those values are being challenged. Not only inside Europe, but also, of course, as we can see, outside Europe as well. At the same time, the idea and the identity of Europe is also about geography. So we quite often think that Europe is only the European Union. But as we know, that's not true. Europe is much bigger than that. There was just a meeting in Yerevan, in Armenia, called the European Political Community, where you had a little bit less than 50 countries and institutions from Europe represented together. And what brought them together? Well, it was the threat of Russia. That's why you had countries like Armenia and Azerbaijan there. That's why you had countries that have subsequently left the European Union, like the United Kingdom there. And by the way, that's why you had Canada there as well. Perhaps someone could think that instead of becoming the 51st state of the United States, Canada could become the 28th member state of the European Union. And here's to my friend Mark Carney. I hope you heard those applause, so good luck. But I think that the most successful policy of the European Union is enlargement. Look, they started with 6 states. In the 1970s, it went to 9 states. Then it went to 10. Then it went to 12. And then there was an absolutely fantastic enlargement in 1995 when it went to 15, with Sweden, Finland, and Austria joining. And an even greater one in 2004, when we went to 24. And then subsequently we clawed it up to 28 member states, almost 500 million inhabitants. And of course, unfortunately, Brexit in 2016. I say a little bit tongue-in-cheek that for the UK, it took them 7 years to negotiate themselves out of the EU. It will take them 7 years to regret, and then it will take them 7 years to come back in. And I hope that Keir Starmer heard those applause as well. So Canada and the UK coming back in. But more seriously, there is a pull power of the European Union. There are countries that want to join, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Moldova, whether it's the Western Balkans. And I think we should welcome that. And we should, instead of always complaining about the European Union, take satisfaction in the fact that, especially in this world, we are able to unite and find common solutions to common problems. My second question today is, why is this Europe's moment? The first answer to that is, it's because of the changing world order. So world orders, especially from a Western perspective, have a tendency to change. After World War I, the order lasted for 2 decades before we ended up in World War II. After World War II, the order lasted for roughly 4 decades before we ended with the end of the Cold War. And from 1989 onwards, we lived in a post-Cold War era, which in my mind ended on the 24th of February 2022, when Russia attacked Ukraine. And of course now, with a new American administration, which has lived through a unipolar world led by the US, is now driving a slightly different foreign policy, which is accelerating the change in the order. So we in Europe, just like Petr said, have to ask ourselves the question, what do we do? I feel that we have security pressure coming from the east, in other words, Russia, and that's not going to end when the war in Ukraine ends. And then we have a transition in the transatlantic partnership with the new US administration and whichever administration comes after that. And don't get me wrong, I'm pro-European, pro-American, and therefore a pro-transatlanticist. But we have to listen to what the United States is saying. And the United States is saying, take more responsibility for your own security. And the United States is saying that, unlike Europe, we don't believe in multilateralism. We don't believe in climate change. We don't believe necessarily in international rules and norms. And then we have to adapt. I think, interesting enough, that Europe has the tools to do that. Remember that the tools that were supposed to bring us together, like trade, technology, or energy, they are now used as weapons which pit us against each other. Europe has exclusive competence on trade. That's why it's very difficult for the US, for instance, to impose excessive tariffs on Europe. Can you imagine if we had 27 different trade policies? We'd have a race to the bottom on tariff policies with, say, the US. Secondly, we have exclusive competence on monetary policy in the ECB, especially the countries that are in the euro. We have exclusive competence on customs, and we have exclusive competence on competition. So we have a lot of the tools which are needed, I think, in this changing world order. And at the same time, if you look at the world around you right now, where do you find stability? I'd say in Europe. We might be a little bit bureaucratic, we might be a little bit slow, we might be a little bit boring, but at least you know what the legislative process is. At least you know which values the EU stands for. And on top of that, of course, we have a huge market. So it's Europe's moment in the sense that we can grow from adolescence to adulthood in so many different ways. They used to say that we Europeans were too dependent on Russian energy, too dependent on American technology and security, and too dependent on Chinese economy. Yeah, to a certain extent, but I think we have the tools to work, not either or, but actually both. My third and final point before I conclude is then to try to give an answer to the question, what should Europe do? Well, the classic answer I would give as a pro-European is that we need to both deepen and widen the European Union. In other words, deepen integration and then widen, enlarge the European Union. We actually need more Europe, not less Europe. We need more Europe on defense. We need more Europe on security. We need more Europe on foreign policy. We need more Europe on the internal market, as Enrico Letta has told us in his report. We need more Europe in fighting climate change. We need more Europe in the financial markets, in research and development, as Draghi has told us in his report. And at the same time, we need a bigger Europe. I believe that we need to have the Western Balkans in the European Union. I believe that we need to have Ukraine in the European Union. I believe that we need to have Moldova in the European Union. And I would love to see Iceland and Norway in the European Union as well. But I'm not going to give advice to my Nordic friends because they might take it the wrong way. And of course, I believe that we should have the United Kingdom back in the European Union. But in order for all of this to happen, we actually need more flexibility. And I don't say this only because I wrote my PhD on flexible integration, the idea that not everyone has to do everything at the same time. But we need to get out of the mindset that the European Union is static and only based on the acquis communautaire. It has always been extremely flexible. Inside the EU, some of us are in the euro, others are not. Some of us are in Schengen, others are not. Some countries get long transition periods to deal with a certain policy. We can't all do the same things at the same time. So I guess you could say that you have countries that are both able and willing. Then you have countries that are able but not necessarily willing. You have countries that are not able but willing. And then you have countries that are not able and not willing. So we don't have to worry about the last one. But the bottom line is that I think we should be open for enlargement, and we need to think about it in innovative, new, flexible ways. So kind of you would end up having three categories. One, those who are EU members. Two, those who are EU candidates or in a special arrangement like the EEA. And then three, you have something that we saw yesterday and the day before, the European political community, as a breeding ground for potential membership. And here's where I come to my conclusion, what would be my humble recommendation? And I should probably add that the Finnish president doesn't do EU policy. I do foreign policy and I'm the commander-in-chief. But if I was thinking about doing European stuff, my first thing that I would do is to say that we now have a window of opportunity. And the window of opportunity is not going to last a long time. It's going to be a similar window of opportunity that we had after the Cold War. And after the Cold War, yes, it was slow, but we took the right decisions. What did we do? We deepened integration in the Maastricht Treaty, in the Amsterdam Treaty, in the Nice Treaty. We enlarged first to Finland, Sweden, and Austria, and then later to Central and Eastern Europe. It was a conscious decision based on the Copenhagen criteria. We need to give that beacon a light to countries that want to join. It is a similar moment to the end of the Cold War, and that window of opportunity is quite short. It'll probably last around 5 years. Second, we need to enlarge the EU and deepen the EU and make it more flexible. I leave it to the lawyers on how they're going to do that, and I fully understand that it's not an easy one. But enlargement now is of geopolitical and strategic importance for the European Union. Look, Ukraine has by far the largest and most modern military in Europe. If our number one security threat is Russia, we need to deter that. How do you deter that? You don't deter it only with percentages, you deter it with capabilities. And there's no other European country that has more impressive capabilities than Ukraine. So I repeat what I said at the press conference yesterday. We need to get out of the mindset that it's only us helping Ukraine. We need to start thinking, how can Ukraine help us? Thirdly and finally, I think we need, because the European Union always works on one project at a time. So in the 80s, it's the internal market. In the 90s, it's the euro. In the 2000s, it's enlargement. In the 2010s, it's a financial crisis. Now, in my mind, it's defense. We have to take more responsibility for our defense. And for me, this doesn't mean either the EU or NATO. It actually means both. NATO is the one that has the command structure, has the operative structure, has the capability. But the EU is the one that can provide the investment, the defense industry, the instruments to push it forward. Now, I'll finish off just by saying that sometimes we just need to stop and think what Europe and what the European Union is all about. Quite often we hear about it always in negative terms. But at the end of the day, think about where Czechia was 30 years ago. Think about where Finland was 30 years ago. Think about where Europe was 30 years ago. And pose the question, are we better off or worse off with Europe and the European Union? If and when the answer is we're better off, let's keep on working at it together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your speech, Mr. President. Luckily, we still have some time to continue in discussion. And let me ask President Pavel to join us on stage too. Thank you. And let me welcome the host of this panel, one of my oldest colleagues. Yes, it's you, Rob. Rob Cameron, BBC Prague correspondent. There he goes. Thank you very
Well, thank you very much. President Pavel, President Stubb, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. The motto of this conference is Europe's geostrategic awakening. What is Europe's state of consciousness right now? Are we fully awake and fully cognizant of the geopolitical and the security threats and perils that surround us? Are we half asleep, aware that there's an alarm going off in the background and perhaps reaching over and hitting the snooze button before turning over? Or are we deep in slumber, unaware of the world in flames around us? President Pavel and President Stubb, I think, are very much in the first camp. But what about the rest of Europe? And President Pavel, if I can start with you, you mentioned in your keynote address there that pragmatism doesn't mean a vacuum of values. And President Stubb, you yourself have spoken of the need for a values-based realism in foreign policy. But isn't, President Pavel, the ultimate realism, the ultimate wake-up call, if you like, isn't that Europe is facing these challenges very much alone?
First, let me thank you. I don't believe we are in Europe alone who thinks the same way. We may have different views now on global issues with current American administration, but not the whole America. We still have democratic partners in Indo-Pacific, and they are pretty much at the same line as we are. So I think the democratic family is definitely much bigger than just Europe.
President Stubb?
I certainly don't feel we are alone. I would hate to think about what it would feel like for Finland right now to be outside the EU and outside NATO. The reason we joined the EU was really a security pretext. We didn't talk about it at the time because of the trauma that we had from the Cold War, but it was for security reasons because we never wanted to be alone again as we were in the Winter War and the War of Continuation. And now, of course, joining NATO, I don't think that would have happened was it not for Russia's attack on Ukraine. That's when public opinion in Finland changed. And we feel that we're not alone at all. Quite the contrary, we feel that we're a big team of not only 27, but I find myself now being in very close attachment to countries that are not even in the EU, but are part of us in the coalition of the willing or elsewhere. So just to give you a few examples, the UK, Canada, Norway, and Iceland. So I don't feel alone at all. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here.
President Pavel, you used, I think, the word assertive to describe the current foreign policy of the current occupant of the White House, or perhaps even the occupant himself. That's a very diplomatic way of putting the foreign policy of President Trump that has left Europe really, as I say, feeling a sense of isolation and certainly a sense almost of shell shock that everything that has been built up in the past 8 decades since the war seems to be crashing down.
I can help myself with one example from NATO, from the first administration of Donald Trump. When he first joined the NATO summit, and he announced that no country that is not paying enough will be defended by the United States, it caused a shock in a room. And then some of more moderate people from administration tried to calm us down, and they suggested just try to detach the man from the message. So I would encourage us to do the same because obviously Donald Trump has a very specific, sometimes irresistible style of politics. But we should focus on what he is saying, not the format, rather the contents. And there are a number of messages that are pretty relevant, and we should pay attention to it. Obviously, one that stands at the top of our list right now is much more European capabilities in security and defense. But it's also about self-confidence. And I was referring to tariff policies when I used the word assertive. And the very fact that tariff policies are a European or EU issue, prevented us from suffering much more. And that's why I believe we should be more self-confident, but based on real and true capabilities, both in security, economy, finances, science, because we have all of the capacity really to be not just the counterweight, but also truly strong and independent partner to the United States.
Thank you. President Stubb, can I ask you, not as, in your words, a European nerd, but perhaps the only man, I'm sure the only man who spent 7 hours on the golf course with President Trump, the leader of a country that is still, in theory, Europe's closest military ally, and I'm sure you have invaluable insights into the mood, not just of the leader of that country, but of its people as well. Do you share that fear that some people do, that the US is slowly abandoning us to our fate?
I think, when you're president, you should be afraid of nothing. You should deal with the world as it is, not as you would wish it to be. One of the reasons we use values-based realism as an instrument or a tool to get us over this transition is to give a message that on one hand we want to stay true to our values, like democracy, freedom, rule of law, human rights, protection of minorities. But on the other side, we're realistic that not everyone will be in the same camp with us. I sort of constructed the idea originally to make sure that we can fight climate change with countries that are not democracies. But of course now I think it's a useful tool in general to be practical. So look at what American foreign policy is and then adjust accordingly. The message from the Americans is, number one, ideological, so that's MAGA, Make America Great Again, and that ideology is anti-international institutions, anti-norms, anti-European Union, anti-globalization, and anti-climate change. Then respectfully disagree with that and try to go instead for the second, which is America First, and look at where can you cooperate with America, whether it's on defense. I mean, for instance, our bilateral defense cooperation with the United States has never been closer than it is right now. So you can still do a lot of bilateral cooperation with the US. And I think we've reacted in the right way. So be pragmatic about what's going on in the transatlantic partnership. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We are still going to stay allies. There are a lot of interests that will continue to keep the United States in Europe, not least the military bases that they have, without which they could not be active in the Middle East or Africa, for instance.
Okay. And in terms of Europe's readiness, President Pavel, if I can ask you as a man who was the highest-ranking military official in NATO, is Europe ready, not in theory, but in reality, for a really sudden, sharp deterioration, a shock in the security of this continent? A violent uprising in Narva in Estonia, perhaps, carried out by the Russian secret services, or little green men popping up on Gotland in the Baltic. Are we really ready to meet those challenges if they happen today, now, this afternoon?
With American presence as it is now, or without?
Let's say with the man in the White House as we know him and the things that he said.
Okay, first, it's good to know that NATO works on unanimity. That means that any action that is to be taken by NATO as a whole will have to be unanimously agreed at the North Atlantic Council. And then, of course, I cannot presume what would be the outcome if there is a limited military action against part of one NATO country. Frankly, that was my biggest fear in my position of chairman of NATO Military Committee, that Russia would not go for a full-scale aggression against NATO, but they would do something like a provocation that would disclose unity or disunity within our political will to commit military force. I believe that after the aggression against Ukraine, political will to use military power is now much greater than any time before. But of course, I cannot speak for American president at this point. But I believe that even if the United States decide not to take part in any military operation, that means they would take something like constructive abstention. Europe could make it with our own resources in case of a limited incursion. In case of a big military aggression, if we are to act without military strategic enablers at this point, we would have serious difficulties. But if we manage to discuss with our American allies the transition that would be reasonable to build our own capabilities, then I think there will be no strategic gap and both sides of the Atlantic will be happy.
President Stubb, what keeps you awake at night in terms of Finland's security? What worries you? What are you thinking about a sudden Russian incursion into Finland's Arctic North, and how your country would be able to respond, presumably before the North Atlantic Council even had the chance to sit down and take that decision that has to be unanimous?
Well, remember that we've been NATO members only for 3 years, 1 month and 1 day. So in that
Someone's
sense,
counting.
I was always an avid NATO advocate, so I wake up with a smile every morning that we're now part of the alliance. But remember that our defense posture was basically there to defend ourselves against the Russian security threat, even alone. So I sleep my nights actually very well, and in my capacity as Commander-in-Chief, I'm one of the few people who sees all the operative plans that we have. And remember that in Finland we still have conscription, so obligatory military service, which means that 1 million men and women have done it, including myself and my son, for instance, and most of the guys here in the front who are from Finland. Then we have over 60 F-18s. We just bought 64 F-35s. We have long-range missiles, air, land, and sea. We have just modernized our Air Force and Navy, are in the process of modernizing our land force. And we have the biggest artillery in Europe together with Poland. So, nothing keeps me awake at night. And believe me, we don't have these military things because we're worried about Sweden.
Yes, of course. Even after a hockey match. Yeah.
We usually beat Sweden in hockey, so it's quite okay.
And in terms of making those plans for the future and improving Europe's defence resilience and having the means to defend ourselves, I mean, Europe does do a lot of talking, but I think both of you mentioned the importance of an increase in production, an increase in coordination and so on. Can Europe do more than talk? Can it actually build and produce things in the defence sector at speed, President Pavel?
I think I cannot agree with the statement that Europe is just talking on security and defense. There are a number of initiatives launched by the European Union, not only in the area of military capability, but also in improving military mobility across Europe. But also programs to encourage defense industry to work more closely together. I think all these strands are there. Obviously, it will take some time, and we can always do more. But I think, in general, EU is on the right track when it comes to increasing our defense capability. The other question is how we will improve cooperation between EU and NATO. And that is a long-term issue, not to duplicate our efforts, but rather work together and synchronize the efforts of both institutions. And a third point in this debate would be a discussion with our American allies about transfer of responsibility and the burden and capacity transition to Europe, which means that we will be talking more about European pillar of NATO and what can we do to make it more institutional, to work with or without American presence.
Thank you. There's fingers being held up at me saying 3 minutes, but so I'd like to just finish with a final question. And if you'll permit me a personal question. Obviously, Friday is the anniversary of VE Day, and as you say, Europe Day as well. The European Union, as you both said, was founded as a peace project, as a response to World War II. By chance, my parents are in this room today. They're visiting me in Prague. And looking around, I won't be offending anybody to say that along with Senator Oltrata in, the fourth row, they're probably the only people who actually lived through the Second World War, who remember it. And I think who still bear, not trauma, but certainly it was a deeply traumatic, a formative time. And certainly my father has said he is incredulous that once again Europe's leaders, people like you, President Stubb and President Pavel, are speaking once again about the very real possibility of another global conflict, perhaps on the same scale. So what's, in conclusion, your message to people of not only their generation, but their children and their grandchildren as well? President Pavel.
I think I would just use a short and well-known saying, if you want peace, you have to be ready for war. So let's be ready.
President Stubb?
On the 9th of May, if there was a choice, should you celebrate Victory Day in Moscow or should you celebrate the European Union? Go for the European Union. It's doing pretty damn well.
Thank you very much indeed.
You've been listening to a special episode of Czechast featuring Czech President Petr Pavel and Finnish President Alexander Stubb. Many thanks to the organizers for making this discussion available, and of course to Jan Bumba and Rob Cameron for moderating it. If you enjoy Czechast, please follow the podcast, leave a review and share it with others. It really helps. And if you haven't yet listened to Blood in Bohemia special series, Rob Cameron and I would be delighted to have your company there too. For now, thanks for listening, stay safe, stay healthy, stay curious, and as we say in Czech, naslyšenou.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.